Hi, I'm Christy, founder of Quinn Foods, and welcome to the Be Better, Do Better podcast, where we showcase the folks fighting for change, questioning, seeking, learning, and doing things differently, for the better, despite how actually freaking hard it might be sometimes. Today I'm talking to activist, educator, and my dear friend Robyn O'Brien. When Robyn's daughter was diagnosed with a food allergy, she dove headfirst into exposing the double standard in our food system through her well-known TED Talk and our highly praised book, The Unhealthy Truth. Side note, my mom gave this to me when I first started Quinn. She's worked tirelessly to advocate for children and families with food allergies and always leading with love and facts. Today, her organization rePlant Capital takes a holistic approach to funding farmers. They help coordinate the use of financial capital and non-financial resources to support farmers making the transition to regenerative organic agriculture. Robyn has been a friend of mine for 7+ years, lives in Boulder, has raised 4 kiddos during her career, and it's beyond inspiring to watch the tremendous amount of impact she's made in our food industry. I'm deeply honored to have her on our Be Better, Do Better podcast. Thanks so much for taking the time to be doing this with me today.
Oh, I mean, it's such a hard ask to get to spend the afternoon with you. I'm so excited.
This should be really fun. Well, I want to keep it. I did a podcast a couple of weeks ago and I wrote down like 500 questions and it almost backfired on me because I was paying attention more to the question and not to the response. So I didn't write down any questions because I just wanted to have a conversation, right? Like we were just sitting down for coffee, even though I'm staring at you in a screen. But I do think it'd be beneficial for those who are listening who have not heard of your name or what you've been doing for the past couple of years and what you've spent your life doing. Why this? I know rePlant is a most recent thing, but how did you get in this industry? I know that, but for those who don't.
Gosh, when you asked why this, I just got the chills all over my body, and I kind of have to listen to that sometimes. I can't imagine working on anything else. I went to business school at Rice University on a full scholarship, and when I was graduating, all the oil and gas companies were recruiting us. I knew I wasn't interested in that. I knew that wasn't my thing, and pursued a job at an investment company on a team that managed $20 billion in assets. And it was the greatest team. They're still friends today. I feel very lucky to have always found incredible teammates to work with. And I think that is part of the trajectory and part of the lesson. But back then, it was 7 of us managing $20 billion in assets. And I was the only woman on the team. So the guy said, you're going to cover the food industry stocks. And so I learned the food industry in a really analytical way. We didn't have kids yet. It was a great job. It was a great team. We had so much fun. We met management teams, people taking their companies public, all the big multinational companies. And that's where I first learned the food industry, which was just on an Excel spreadsheet, really, meeting management teams. And then we relocated to Boulder in the year 2000, 21 years ago, which is crazy when we had our first kid.
That is crazy.
And I had loved that job so much, and I had stayed so close to the guys that I worked with. And my thought was, I'm going to go back into that. So if we're going to start a family, let's do it fast. So we had 4 kids in 5 years. And
oh my gosh, I did not realize that. That is insane.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, it's insane. And it was insane when they were little. And now as they're all hitting the exit to college, It's insane in a different way, but it's really fun. And I have a lot of gray hairs to show for it. But as we had our family, it was my youngest child had this allergic reaction. And, it forced me to look at the food industry through a lens that I had not carried when I was an analyst. And as I started asking these questions, people were pushing back. Some people were enormously supportive, like the guys that I used to work with. And so I was sort of harnessing all this information. And it was, on the one hand, food allergies and the just skyrocketing number of kids with food allergies. But when you're looking into data on kids' health, you don't just get to pull the food allergy file. All of a sudden there was data on diabetes, and there was data on autism, and there was data on pediatric cancer. And I couldn't unlearn that data once I saw it. And I thought, what is happening to the health of our children? And if this is my one child, exponentially what's happening here, and what happens to a country if children are this sick. And so I kept trying to understand for my own daughter's diagnosis, but also this greater this greater pull that I was feeling towards our children's generation, to try to like figure out, is there something we can do to make this better? And so, I went back into the analysis of the food industry where I had had this formal career and realized that, we had not always asked the greatest questions as analysts, and that, we were only focused on margins and profitability, and we hadn't really looked at these externalized costs. And as I began to dig deeper, I realized that our own American food companies were formulating products differently here versus overseas. And so overseas, they would put in more holistic ingredients and more wholesome ingredients and less additives and less artificial stuff. Mm-hmm. So they were just actual ingredients. And then here in the US, we kind of got these like concoctions that looked red, but it wasn't really red, and it smelled like something, but it wasn't really that something. And so it was artificial. And I really began to go down that rabbit hole. And I think it's important for people to know that that was hard. And it wasn't something I wanted to do. I wasn't raised in any kind of activism. I wasn't raised to be this kind of whistleblower on an industry of this size. So at the same time, I was sort of unearthing and unpacking all of this information about the food industry that I had covered. And we had covered it well. We did really well as a team. It was sort of this, I was also dealing with an enormous grief at realizing we had a double standard in the U.S. food system. And so my career has really always been in food and ag. It always has been, for now 20-something years. And the last 15 or so has really been on bringing attention to the fact that we can do better by our farmers and by our families in our food system, by how we choose to not only shop, at the grocery store, but also by how we choose, what we seed into the ground. And I think for too long, we've been too divorced from those things. I think for too long, moms have been too far from farmers, and that really you can't take a better group of people than if you were to take moms and farmers and put them together and say, hey, go solve for this. And, we launched rePlant to really solve for that transition, to say, hey, in the United States today, 80% of consumers are trying something organic, and 75% of grocery store categories carry something organic, but only 1% of our farmland is organic. And that is crazy. And so we're not growing what our own country wants to eat. And the people that hurts the most, besides the moms and the families and the kids, are the farmers. Mm-hmm. And so, to really like close that gap and say, hey, this is where we are, and this is what we need. And it's not a fad, and it's not a trend, because guess what? Food allergies aren't a fad, and cancer is not a trend. Like, we really need to make this shift in our supply chain. And so that's where the last 15 years has been a lot of really high-level consulting with the multinational food companies, a lot of speaking to and working with farmers, sitting down, and then just so much listening, and really trying to harness all of this information and bring it together and create a solution that's actually going to help solve for the problem. And that was, thankfully, in the creation of rePlant Capital with Dave Haynes and Don Schaefer, I found two just incredible business partners to really create this entity that can help transition American farmland to regenerative organic agriculture, so that the farmers are ensured a stronger profitability and financial resiliency, that the consumer is actually, we're actually growing what the 21st century consumer wants. And then for the multinational food company, that bottleneck they've got on their supply chain starts to expand and open back up.
Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness. Where do I even start with all the questions? It's like a very big thing you're doing. Backing up to the whistleblowing, because I think that's so critical to call out, and the activism part, because you can either be in food and not take those roles, right? Not take that role and just keep going, right? I mean, especially in CPG, you're making a product and that's all you care about. And, but from an activist perspective, and whistleblowing, I mean, what was some of the first things that you did, 15 years ago or 10 years ago? That you were like, hello, this isn't how we should be doing it. Who did you speak to, and what did you do? Because I think that there's so many conversations, as you know, and you're talking from, because you have direct experience. But I'm just so curious on how that went, especially back, 15 years ago.
It's interesting because 15 years ago, we were standing on such a different landscape, and not a lot of people were talking about this. When I tried to suggest that we had a double standard in our food supply, people, they don't want to hear that. That's a really hard thing to hear. And so, I sat with the knowledge for probably about 6 to 9 months, and it almost killed me. I would be at a park and I would see children, or we'd be at school in the cafeteria and I'd see what was being served and know that Kellogg's made a higher quality, better integrity, better ingredient product for kids in other countries. And you can't sit with that kind of discord for very long without it actually personally impacting you. And it did. It was very stripping. Physically, I look back on that period and I was being stripped of a belief system, and you could physically see that in me. And so, I need to start there, that it was very, very hard and very, very isolating. And at the same time, I couldn't not say something. So I've always been such a student. I love to learn and I love to study things. And so I thought, how can I study how to communicate this? And I have also always studied languages. In high school, I studied French, Spanish, and German. And then when I got to college, I studied French, Spanish, and Japanese. And then when I first started working, I was working at this advertising agency, and they handed me these financial statements. I remember looking at them thinking, I don't speak this language, and that's why I went back to business school, was to learn the language of finance and the language of accounting and the language of business. And it's funny because in my brain, I see these things as equations, a sentence is an equation of this plus this plus this equals your sentence. And math, you have those same equations, so the language piece of this has always been really interesting to me. And as I was looking at who was talking about our food system and genetically engineered ingredients and pesticides, and the way people would talk about it was terrifying, and I'd listen to them and I'd feel like, just be quiet, I can't listen. I've had 4 kids, and it's hurts to hear you say these things and think that, when I was pregnant, I ate this way, or I fed my child this way, and it physically hurt to listen. And I thought, I can't do that. I can't do that to other moms. I can't communicate this way to other moms. And I don't know how I'm going to communicate this. And so I studied different famous figures who have brought a concept to light that was considered disruptive. And the first was Martin Luther King Jr. And as I studied his speeches and the language in which he spoke, it was so clear that it was through love. So I thought, okay, note to self, because that's just a huge part of who I am. And so I'm like, okay, if I can leverage love and have that be the force, that's a really expansive energy and much more inviting than fear. And so then another person that I studied was Harvey Milk. And, here he was running on campaigns for gay rights, enormously controversial back when he was doing it. And he used gratitude. He always thanked his audience for spending the time and giving him their time, to spend with him. And so I thought, okay, love, and I can use gratitude. And then I studied Al Gore because of, his work in climate and the fact that he wasn't widely embraced as the messenger that he could have been. And I felt that as I, and this was back, 10, 15 years ago, the solutions weren't strong enough. And so if you're going to take somebody down into the depths of this kind of knowledge, to do it holding them in love, to do it with an enormous amount of gratitude that they're giving you their time. And then lastly, to really empower them with solutions. That was where I landed on how best to communicate.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And so, I think back to that time, and I had to study. I had always been a student, and so I studied how I was going to communicate this. I studied how other people were communicating it and where I felt that they could do better. And, I also really felt that the data was absolutely jaw-dropping. When you look at the data around children's health and, cancer is the leading cause of death by disease in kids under the age of 15. I mean, that's just, you don't need anything more compelling than that. And the statistics around food allergies, the statistics around autism. I think about the movie Rain Man when it came out. Like, we hadn't seen autism, and now autism is all around us, every day. So I let the data speak for itself. And I really, whenever I speak to an audience or a group that's really trying to figure out how to communicate, I'm like, look, lead with the data. The data is powerful in and of itself. And so I remember when I first sat down to draft the first newsletter that I was going to push out. I mean, I was terrified. Terrified probably didn't even capture how I felt. I was terrified. I was alone.
There's so many unknowns.
I know. And I didn't know what people were going to say. I mean, people really close to me were saying not very nice things. And so, I really had to sit with that. Am I going to be kind of shamed into silence because I'm thinking differently? So I often will say, it was like I had fallen down a well and I was going through every emotion you can imagine, from sadness to grief to anger to fear. And I realized that I felt all of those emotions because I loved. And so really, once I was like, okay, this is a love thing. And I knew I had that. There was a lot I was going to have to figure out, but I knew I had that. And, really that has always been the core and the center of my work. And when that gets muddy or murky, when I don't feel that I'm operating from my heart, it's when I know to just literally close things down and spend some time really sitting with whatever issue or wherever I am to make sure that I come back to that center.
It's so important. Especially as you're doing this work, given how many folks in the industry are not against, but I think everyone we know they're for this, but they just, to some extent, they're learning as we're learning as we go. But I do think it's so important to come back to your center, your intuition, why you started this, and leading with love, because there's a lot of naysayers, a lot of distraction that clouds your thinking. And it gets really hard
I think
at
about
times.
Each chapter has unfolded. So where it started with food allergies, that's where it started, was advocating for children with food allergies, for advocating for my daughter who was not even old enough to talk. Mm-hmm. And I had to learn how to be brave for her because she was too little to do it. And so when I realized that legislation had failed and people said, oh, you need to reach out to your local congressman. Well, at the time that was Congressman Udall. And I just thought, oh my God, that seems so scary. And I pictured this silver haired guy behind this huge mahogany desk and thinking I've never done this before. Who am I to go in there? And to break it down into these littler steps, that first meeting was with staff that was all in their 20s. They were super excited. They had siblings with food allergies, and really to break it down into these, digestible parts that you can take on piece by piece by piece. And I think that was always the approach, was where are the action items that I can focus on? And suddenly 15 years in, you look back and you're like, wow, this is pretty amazing. And it's 15 years this week that Tori had that allergic reaction. And it's 10 years this week that I locked into giving that TED Talk in Austin. And I was squishy. I was really trying not to lock into that thing. I didn't want to do it. And it was an old friend from high school that I'd played soccer with who was leaning on me. And she said, this is the right platform for you. And so it's really, I've learned to really see fear as something that's going to regularly show up. So I'm not intimidated by it, but really I think fear can be sort of this seatbelt that just sort of straps you in your comfort zone. And so now when it shows up, I'm like, oh yeah, I feel what you're trying to do. You're trying to keep me here, and not today, and you just unpop it and you keep going forward. But I think you can't have courage without fear. The two coexist all the time. And, getting back to my language stuff, courage is derived from the French word for heart. And so, really keeping that as my compass has served me really well, because there have been so many curveballs, and there have been so many haters, and there have been so many naysayers. And thank goodness I didn't let them deter me, because the work is too important. And I think it's why the community of people that are in this space are so tremendous, because it's a calling for so many of us. You can't imagine not doing it. And once you understand that there's this responsibility and there's actually something we can do to make it better and to fix it, how could you not live your life in service to that solution? And I think the part that I'm so grateful for is that, as isolating as it was 15 years ago in the very beginning of the work, the family that I have around me today and the people that I get to work with today are such tremendous human beings, and I'm so proud of them. And I think, something I've always loved is just being able to be really generous with my network and say, where can I help? What can we do? Can I make this introduction? Because ultimately that's what's going to get us there. Leveraging the collective talents and the relationships that we all bring to this to really drive this change.
It's so true. And we're our community. We're so lucky that we have our community. I mean, if you think about what we're trying to do, and if we didn't have this, it would be extremely lonely. And
I couldn't have done it from any. Yeah, I couldn't have done it from anywhere else. And I remember flying back into my hometown of Houston the first year that I learned this information, and flying over this city of like 10 million people and thinking, I'm crazy. Like, how do I do this? Like, what I've been in the Boulder bubble too long, like, how are we actually going to do this? And it was, again, like breaking it down into steps. It was after that TED Talk went online, when the CEO of Nestle's frozen food division reached out, I was like, okay, that is one big, powerful CEO on the inside who understands what that's about. Mm-hmm. And then there was another one, and then there was another one, And so again, it's allowing yourself to celebrate these little wins. I'm a huge fan of that as a mom too. You celebrate the little wins. But really, those little wins add up. And, while I was working on some, you were working on some, and other friends of ours were working on some. And all of a sudden, 5-10 years in, we're in such a different place to where we were 15 years ago.
Oh my gosh, completely. I mean, even 10 years ago when we started, you would talk about transparency and everyone would just look the other way, or like, you can't do that, or any of it, right? I mean, it's like, no, you can do it. It's just the willingness to do it. Because like you said, I mean, too much. How do you just look in the other direction? How do you know that information and turn a blind eye and not do something about it?
And it was the CEO at Nestle where I really started to understand how systemic this is. And, I often say you can't fix a broken food system with a broken financial system. Ultimately, it's not just the consumer that's the stakeholder in this, it's those shareholders. And if the shareholders don't know what they're talking about, then you're really in trouble. And so as I was meeting with the CEO of Nestle, the frozen food division, he leaned in and he said, look, Robyn, you can say things I can't say. And I'm so afraid that if we don't make these changes, we're going to go from 5 floors to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 in this building in Ohio. And I looked at him and I was like, what are you afraid of? And he just didn't hesitate. He said, my board of directors. And at that moment, I thought, wow, I've spent, up until that point, I'd spent a handful of years really educating the consumer. And all of a sudden it was like, okay, this is your governance. So your consumer can be saying all of this, but if these guys, and it was primarily guys, on that board, are governing the decision-making, that board's got to have a clue, or else you're just going over a cliff. And so it was realizing that we really needed to start educating the capital. And that was probably the very first kind of inclination I had towards rePlant. I wasn't calling it rePlant. We weren't in conversations yet as co-founders, but I knew that we were going to have to educate the capital somehow. And I spent some time in New York, speaking at Bloomberg and Morgan Stanley and some of these other really well-known financial institutions, and really kind of thought, if we can model this, it's going to be similar to what we've seen in the food industry, where the innovation that we've seen in the food industry has come through acquisition. So, Annie's was acquired by General Mills, and all of a sudden that DNA is infusing General Mills, and Applegate gets, acquired by Hormel, and all of a sudden the DNA starts to infuse Hormel. Those were expensive acquisitions of like $800 million a pop. The financial world's going to be similar. They are not engineered or designed for this kind of operating procedure internally. However, I do think it's going to be that same innovation by acquisition. So you have these pretty conventional banks. They aren't thinking in terms of regenerative capital. They aren't thinking in terms of impact. And it's organizations that are outside of those institutions that are really going to lead and drive the change. And so with that, that was really 4 or 5 years ago, we started to noodle on what it would look like to create some kind of impact organization that could really start to drive this change in the food industry. And it was some back-to-back keynotes that I gave to General Mills and Nestle, actually, where at that point, the senior executives were on board. They're feeding their kids organic. They know that the consumer's asking for organic, and they know that their supply chain isn't there. And I said, if Wall Street's got you guys on this quarterly earnings model and it takes 3 years to transition farmland, there's a timeline tension there, and that capital doesn't give you that timeline for the conversion. You need an alternative source of capital. And I mean, Christy, like that, both those meetings back to back, all the heads leaned in. And they were like, where is that? And we were not public yet. And I was like, it's coming, it's coming. So it's been so much fun to like bring this solution to market, and to be able to go back to the multinationals and say, we are launching a $250 million fund to help convert the U.S. supply chain towards regenerative organic practices. And guess what? That meets your need for your consumer, your 21st century consumer. That meets your needs for the products that you're rolling out. And then the best part to me is that it helps build financial resiliency for U.S. farmers. And that's what's unique, is to put the farmer first and say, we don't have food security if there is not security for U.S. farmers, in their livelihoods. And anybody who pays attention to the U.S. farm economy knows it's in really bad shape. You go out into Nebraska to Steve's farm, you go out into Kansas, and half the towns are sort of papered up and sort of consolidated into one. And where there were 3 high schools, now there's one. And you feel that constriction, and you feel the grief and the pain that's in there, as there's just been this contraction towards these commoditized crops that the consumer in the U.S. is saying, you know what, I'm looking for plant-based, or I'm looking for free from. And
they're not interested in that anymore, but yet we're still growing that, right? There's a massive disconnect there.
Right. And so, for us to be able to say, how do we put the farmer first? And, to come in with a loan that's tied to soil health, because if a farmer is farming with regenerative practices or organic practices, they are taking such good care of the soil. And the soil is this incredible carbon sink that we stand on. So they're taking care of all of us so far beyond our dinner tables. And we looked at that and we thought, there needs to be recognition and compensation for that stewardship. So to tie cost to capital to these better soil practices. So the stronger the metrics around water conservation, water infiltration, soil organic matter, nutrient density, eventually carbon sequestration, the stronger those metrics, the lower the cost of capital. So the farmer's going to save money by those soil health practices. And then we bring in a technical assistance partner, depending on the region, depending on the crop, to help walk the farmer through that transition. Because that's not me, that's not Dave Haynes, who was with Greenmont, it's not Don Schaefer, who was with RSF. Like, that's an on-the-ground guy who knows what he's doing in that technical assistance. And then we bring in a guaranteed buyer. So we leverage the relationships that we have with these multinationals. And again, all of it is to mitigate the risk for the farmer.
That's incredible. So some of the ones that you're working with right now, when you say multinationals, what are you referring back to? The larger...
Yeah, so, it really is, the interest is across the board. General Mills announced a year and a half ago that they wanted to convert 1 million acres to regenerative agriculture, and they were hoping to get 25 farmers to sign up in the first 3 years. They had 180 farmers sign up in 3 days. So, all of a sudden they're like, well, how do we finance this? And then Danone, as North America's largest B Corp, what is so great is farmers in their network are converting their farms to B Corp certified farms. So within the Danone network, MVP Dairy, which is in Ohio, is our nation's first B Corp certified dairy farm. I mean, imagine the impact of that. And so we actually said, okay, let's look at dairy. Dairy can arguably be the messiest part of the food system. I mean, it's got so many pieces coming in. It's got so much stuff, externalities going out. And so we went to this dairy farms, 4,000 cows, and really worked with these two families that run it on the livestock feed side. So in simply converting livestock feed from conventional commodities to non-GMO crops, the impact that's made there. And then getting inside these barns and looking at water use and the way that you can use that efficiently, to help take care of the health of the animals. And then beyond that, what was really exciting was sitting down with these guys, and it's two families of just all brothers, and they are awesome and hilarious. And, I said, if we wrote you guys a check right now today, what would you use it for? And he just didn't hesitate. He's like, a biodigester. And I'm like, talk to me, what is that? And he said, you put it on the farm and it captures the methane that's coming off the dairy farm and then repurposes it as a natural gas that then can fuel the entire farm. And then whatever extra we have over, you can sell it into the community. So to look at what can be ugly, messy, dirty, and figuring out how to make that zero waste, is an enormous impact. And for those who don't believe dairy should be anywhere on the face of the planet, that, again, in a practical way, that's not happening anytime soon. So if we can convert these large scale dairy practices to zero waste, that's an immediate environmental impact. And then at the same time, Danone is also saying, we recognize this shift towards plant-based. So we see how our portfolio is going to shift towards plant-based. So at the same time, you can work with a company like that out in the Central Valley in California with their almond growers. And as those almond growers are converting to regenerative practices in these almond orchards, it's like a 500% increase in water infiltration. So again, this is a sizable, meaningful impact around some of our most precious assets that nobody has on the balance sheet. We don't put clean air on a balance sheet. We don't put clean water on the balance sheet. We don't put healthy soil on the balance sheet. And so to really work with these companies and work with these farmers to transition to these better practices, it just makes good business sense. It's good business sense for the farmer. It's good business sense for the company.
I mean, I love back to the Danone partnership with the brothers and the 4,000 cows. I mean, that's kind of fascinating that they knew exactly what they needed and they were leaning into that. And I'm not by any means, I don't even think I've been on a dairy farm, so I should not be talking. But my question to you is, I mean, do you think that is rare, their thinking in that regard? And if so, how do we educate others to kind of think more out of the box and think regeneratively around the spectrum, not just with soil, but
that's such a good question. It's not as rare as it used to be, and it's accelerating quickly, which is great news. And I think it's a financial motive. We don't try to sell anybody on climate. We don't try to sell anybody on pesticides. It's not even about that. It is about what makes the most financial sense to you. And the reason this makes sense is because farmers are in debt because they have to repeatedly purchase that portfolio of agrochemicals to grow genetically engineered crops. Like they are on a pesticide treadmill. And, consumers have made noise about that for a long time because we've been worried about the health impact. The flip that nobody really examined was the financial impact that has on the growers. They are so in debt to these chemical companies because they constantly have to keep purchasing all these portfolio of chemicals. So when they start to see the guy down the street get a new truck, and when they start to see that financial resiliency and that profitability emerge for that particular grower, you don't need to say anything. That's when the curiosity starts. And we are hearing that consistently. So there's a grower that we've worked with who's in Indiana. He farmed 7,000 acres. He had conventional corn and soy. As he decided to convert his conventional corn and soy to regenerative, and he was, like a lot of farmers, he was not going to go organic. That's like asking a Republican to convert to a Democrat or a Democrat to, it's just like so polarizing. Yeah. So he was willing to say, I'll go regenerative because of the cost savings, because I'm not buying all these chemicals. In the first year, he saved $500,000 by not buying the chemicals for his farm and learning how to service the soil without chemicals. So then, 7, 8 years in, you think about that impact, not only on soil health, but also on the financial health of that farm family. So I think it's there. To me, again, it gets back to the sense of equations. Like, this makes sense economically for American farmers. And so much so that the food companies are seeing, how can they be in partnership there with that? What's been fascinating is that Danone was the first partner that we brought in, and they signed a letter of intent that any cost savings they generated through the projects would go back into regenerative projects, which is great to see. Awesome. As you work with other companies, you realize that they don't know their supply chain the same way. Every company has a different relationship with their growers, if they have one at all. So that has been really eye-opening in my career, to realize that, unfortunately, a lot of these companies don't know their growers. They know ADM and Cargill. And that has been the blessing of this pandemic period, is that it's enabled a lot of these multinationals to really lean in and get to know their farmers. I get calls asking, these companies asking, help us think through our climate strategy, because they recognize that's what everybody's talking about. And one company said, we were thinking of buying carbon offsets in South America. And this is a food company, an organic food company. And I said, that sounds like something United Airlines would do. Like, why would you go about buying carbon offsets in South America when you can figure out those carbon offsets, like, in your own supply chain, like, tell your own story? And that's when, they said, we don't know our farmers. So again, the opportunity right now, it gets back to that transparency of saying, we understand this is where we need to go, and we're not there yet. And we are bringing partners and collaborators around the table to help us get there. And I think, again, if you can stand in that transparency, it makes it way less intimidating, of just saying, this is where we're going, and we're learning that we have these opportunities as it relates to water conservation, or these are the opportunities as it relates to nutrient density, to really start where you stand and, lean into the things that get you excited. For me, it's water. I mean, water is just my North Star. And I think as we learn more and more about these practices, the benefit for water infiltration, the benefit for water conservation, that does so much for all of us. So, to me, that's a huge part of the focus.
Yeah, I'm learning about that. I'm not up to speed entirely there. I have a question on, as you go through this movement, and you're realizing there's so many pieces to this, right? It's not perfect, right? And even you say, we have to meet where we're at and meet the growers where they're at, and then understand what they need to move forward in this direction, however it is. If they're focused on water, if they're focused on other things. But for the smaller groups in the industry, smaller CPG brands who don't know where they're getting their ingredients from. Sorry, I knocked my mic off the desk. This desk is so tall, so I'm trying to figure out how to hold this mic. But I guess my question is, the supply chain is so fascinating, and there's so much that smaller companies can do, but there's also like a resource thing here, right? With employees, we don't have enough time. We have our definitely P&L to look at, investors questioning everything that we're doing and why, and does that make sense from a P&L perspective? But curious, because I'm on this side I'm clearly on this side, but we do know where we're getting our ingredients from, and it's not always perfect. I mean, we're using a lot of third party, and then we're using the Dave Vetters of the world, and we're trying to figure out how we can get our sorghum up and running with Steve Tucker. But I guess my question is, like, given that and the complexity around it, I mean, what would your advice be to those in my shoes and trying to do better, but not knowing how, and knowing that it is complex, but there are certain ways you can go about it. How do you look at that? Because I know that the frustrating part for me is that you have these big CPG companies that are leading most of the growth, right? So we obviously have to figure that out. But all the other smaller brands make up a good chunk of this too. And so how can we all be better in tangent with the rest?
That's a great question. And I'm named after a small farmer, and she's a single mom of 3 daughters, grown daughters now. And I think it has been sort of this internal compass of mine, because I can visualize her farm and her work and ensuring that the solution isn't just the solution for at scale. So as we were launching, we were hearing from a lot of smaller farmers. And again, it gets back to this like radically collaborative and generous nature of the 3 co-founders, which is totally infusing the DNA of rePlant now as a team. We would hear from these guys, and they'd say, I've been trying to get General Mills to return my call for years, and it's, you have to know who the right person is inside of these organizations. We heard from farmers that had 400 acres to farmers in Canada that had 30,000 acres that they had converted. And, they were like, look, we have, 30,000 acres of organic barley or whatever it was. And again, it's to hold these relationships and realize that they are so much stronger together. And so, to quickly, I don't hesitate to make those introductions because, again, there's no food security without farmers. So we need to ensure financial resiliency for our farmers. And if that means, they can start to network into Anheuser-Busch InBev, which has the 7th fastest growing beer in America, which just happens to be their organic, Michelob Ultra Organic. They've got a problem because the supply chain isn't here. And so they don't know where to find those farmers because those relationships have only ever been with ADM and Cargill. And so we have the ability. Yeah, we have the ability to sort of facilitate those introductions. And I just don't hesitate. And as hard as it was giving that TED Talk 10 years ago, it's out there. And it's like I said where I stood on the issue. And so anyone that can Google it can see that I was concerned about this, 10 years ago. And I think that helps the farmers know, because there are a lot of opportunists that come into any space and they try to sort of, sing and dance all the right tunes. The farmers smell that, that. And it's like, they've had so much BS shoveled their way their entire careers. They've had so many empty promises. And I've really found that in working with the farmers, whenever I'm on farm, one of the questions I always ask is, what is your local hospital seeing? And the answers are heartbreaking and also really informative. And you really, again, humanize the whole thing. So the other way that we've been able to work with the smaller farmers, besides just facilitating those introductions, is we're collecting the data in real time. And as they reach out to us through the website, we have a questionnaire that they then fill out, because it's fascinating. Some need capital for acquisition of acreage. Some need capital for the certification process. Some need capital for technical assistance. Some need it for equipment, So it's not one size fits all. So right now we're capturing all that data to try to determine which products, we should be offering and helping, in the support of the smaller growers. But I hear you with the smaller brands. I think of Seth Goldman. He was one of our early investors, and he spoke to a class that I teach at Rice called the New Food Economy. And he would say, build it into the DNA of the brand, make it an irrefutable part of who you are, make it something that you won't won't compromise on. And then you find a way. And I do think the young farmers coalitions that are emerging, the conversations that we're having now with ag commissioners at the state level, people are looking for this. And not only are they looking for the supply chain, but really importantly, they're looking for someone who can teach them. And so that technical assistance partner, that to me is a really exciting space that's emerging because, the farmers have gone from this chemical input model to learning how to service the soil. And the beauty of that is that once you transition and learn how to steward and service the soil in this regenerative way, like you can't unlearn that stuff. So maybe it costs a little bit up front in terms of like a consulting service fee, to hire these guys to come out on your farm. But then you really, you're off of that treadmill of the chemicals and the debt that's required to finance it. But I think the system we've inherited was arrogant. It was one size fits all, both on the food side and the finance side. And to really think, where are the regional opportunities? One of my co-founders, Don Schaefer, he coined the term integrated capital. And I think it's so relevant here because it allows you to tap into all different types of capital stacks, whether it's grants, whether it's loans, whether it's private equity, to figure out, what you need in the current moment right now to help transition you into the next stage. And so for us, the $250 million fund, 80% of it is loans to farmers. And the other 20% are the ag technologies that we're starting to see that can help accelerate this transition. And for us, really is listening to the farmers. And, as you would know, it's like they provide wheat to one company and then they also send some over here. And again, to have that conversation within these smaller brands of where can we create those synergies? It reminds me of meeting I had at Patagonia when Rose was still there and Yvonne was there. And it was just this phenomenal day. It was really trying to think about the supply chain as it relates to organic cotton. And, I told them, I said, cotton rotates with peanuts. So instead of trying to just solve for cotton, collaborate with the peanut company that needs organic peanuts. And so I think that's what we have to give ourselves permission to do, is to collaborate in different and creative ways to solve for these problems. Because if we stay in that mindset that we've inherited, which is the system that broke farming, we're not going to get out of it. So,
I love what you just said, the chemical wheel. You can't get off that hamster wheel, essentially, if you don't know how, right? You have no idea because you've never been brought up that way. But once you do, it's cultural too, because, we had a call with the USDA last week, and, one of the points that the scientists made, which was so fascinating to me, was that almond growers had been conditioned to have a clean floor. So in an almond orchard, the ground under the trees is clean, and there's so much pride in a clean floor. And when you're asking them to transition to regenerative agriculture, you have to put cover crops down, and it makes the floor look dirty. And so just that psychological shift from like being really proud of this clean floor to having a dirty floor, again, like, there's so much education. And I think it's really exciting to me. We hear from, 26-year-olds and all these people on the ground that are really working to help transition farms. And I think that particular space of technical assistance, it's going to be so much fun to watch over the next couple of years. Definitely, because the technical assistance is so needed. And then I have a question on, the growers, they're doing one thing, but we've been having a lot of conversations of farmers growing particular crops for us, right? And a lot of them are coming out of conventional growing. Right? So they're not 100% regenerative, they're not transitional, they're not organic. The challenge we've been seeing is that once we identify those partnerships and lean in there, that's one step. The second step is, from our perspective, we have to clean it and mill it and buy it. Like, we're not buying bushels, right? We're buying finished product. We can buy bushels, but then we're not fully integrated to set up that way. I wish we were, but we weren't. We're not, the General Mills of the world and ABVEB. So my question for you is, have you seen a lot of this from your conversations with growers on, are they concerned about that? I mean, growing and then clearly finding buyers to buy. I mean, we've been having to work with third parties, and the fact that if we have these conversations and we're moving in the right direction, then we need to actually put them in touch with like a pipeline, for example, or Grain Place with Dave Vetter. But they're very rare, and they don't truly exist across the country. Those little outlets of, okay, we can clean and we can sort and we can mill.
Yep, because and it's the same problem in ranching. So it's the exact same problem in ranching. And I think, again, the consolidation of the food system created these vulnerabilities, and COVID exposed that. When we saw what happened in these meat packing plants and the consolidation there, for example, it put the meat supply at risk. And there are probably plenty of plant-based people would be like, that's not a bad thing. However, it really exposed the frailties and the vulnerability in the system. And the same thing here. We've had such mass consolidation that the concern now is, it doesn't take much to disrupt something that's that consolidated. So that for us was why it was really important to focus on a regionalized approach. And what we've heard from ranchers, and I can hear it echoing in your questions, is how can we online regional processing again? Because it's become so consolidated that the economics don't make sense to the smaller companies. It's just it's virtually impossible. So you're literally screening out innovation in an industry, which is so dangerous.
You are screaming it out because it doesn't exist, and there's such a buckle because there's a need, yet how are we going to process it and then throw it into our product? Not to mention, I mean, you have the ardent mills in the world, and, ancient grains. There's maybe a handful of these in place right now, but it's super challenging on so many levels.
And I mean, again, I think, as I listen to you, it's so much of this one-size-fits-all mindset is what has brought us to this just incredibly broken place. And so to step back and say, how can we regionalize this? Where can we localize a solution, and how does that put power back into the hands of the growers and the farmers and the food companies and the innovators? And that's daunting, for sure. That is daunting to the powers that be that have benefited from this consolidated system. However, they haven't. COVID exposed, just last year, the pandemic exposed just what we all knew was that we had 30 to 40% of the food that we produce is wasted. We saw that on display during the last year. We also know that we have just record numbers of food insecurity. Again, that was on display with the food banks that are wrapped around. So how do we actually regionalize these solutions? Because that is actual food security. And I think you start at the state level. I think you really start at the state level. So imagine if the growers in the state of Colorado came together to work with our ag commissioner, who is phenomenal, a young woman named Kate Greenberg, and, came to her and said, look, this is what we need to put in place. Let's figure out a public-private partnership. I mean, we're in conversations with the state already. There's stuff going on in California, at the state level. The ag commissioner in the state of Ohio is a woman. The ag commissioner for Virginia was just pulled, into the USDA, another woman. So, if we've learned anything from the work and policy in the food industry, is that you can actually enact a lot of change at the state level that can then influence federal policy. So we saw that with genetically engineered ingredients and labeling there. We were able to really mobilize consumers and policymakers at the state level to create this awareness and education of the need for this. I see the same thing in a lot of ways here in regenerative agriculture, that there's so much that we can do at the state level, which makes financial sense, it makes economic sense, it makes environmental sense. And it's also a lot more accessible and attainable than trying to change it up at the federal level and the consolidated level.
So if you wanted to learn more, I mean, I could talk to you for like 5,000 hours. I feel like we just scraped the surface on this. We're going to have you back like 5 times, 10 times. But I'm really interested in learning more about this. I know that hopefully others who eventually listen to this podcast will be. But where, if we're interested in learning more, I mean, what are you reading, or what books or podcasts have really kind of been like oh wow moment to you, and start educating ourselves more about this, where would you go if you were me? What would you start?
I listen to as many farmers as I can.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can, I guess, but those who are listening can't. Where do you think they should go to learn more?
So the Rodale Institute is a phenomenal resource for regenerative. The founder of the Rodale Institute was the first to use the word regenerative 60 years ago. So they've been ahead of this for a very long time. The resources they have are incredible, just as sort of a macro, at a macro level. American Farmland Trust is another organization that is just remarkable in its leadership in this space. For rePlant, we come in beside these entities, as just a full-blown collaborator to figure out how to help finance that transition, to bring in the capital, and it's philanthropic capital, it's high net worth individuals. There have been just some remarkable people who have come into the Soil Fund with us. And we bring them in, and I think it's really catalyzing this conversation. Bank of the West invited us to participate in a webinar, and they were great. They were so candid. They said, we've been conventional ag. We're not going to pretend to be something we're not, but we really understand what's happening here, and we want to explore that conversation. So, we did that webinar. We've done a webinar with Congressman Joe Neguse here in Colorado, who we are so lucky to have representing us on this. He's absolutely amazing and just an incredible guy to spend time with. But he also introduced 2 pieces of legislation on soil health in his first year in Congress, and they immediately got bipartisan support in an era where nothing got bipartisan support. So he's another phenomenal resource for people that really want to understand what's happening here. And then on rePlant's webpage, we have a press page, and there are different articles that have featured, different players in some of the work that we're doing. There's a woman, Chloe Sorvino, who writes for Forbes, and she really, really has her finger on the pulse here. She's incredibly passionate about it and incredibly knowledgeable. So she's another journalist, I think, that you could follow on this. But, more than anything, get out and spend time on a farm. Understand what these guys are dealing with. Every time I'm on a farm, I want to pack every member of Congress on a bus and bus them out there.
I know.
To see what's happening.
Really, it's amazing.
It's amazing. And they don't know. They don't know. Yeah. So, I think if people understood what was actually happening in Nebraska and Kansas and Iowa, they would understand that it's critical, that we overhaul like this. And I think for my team, the urgency that we all feel, to do the work at scale, Dave will often say, we need to do this at scale with Alacrity, is very, very true. And so that's where, the more that we can collaborate, introduce, support, that's what we'll do.
Yeah, that's amazing. Have you heard of People's Company? Have you been in touch with those guys?
I've heard of it. Remind me though.
They're based out. I think he was actually in New Jersey when he called me, but they're based in the Midwest, and they have they're working with a lot of organic growers, and then some conventional, but they're all very interested in the regenerative ag movement, right? Because it is coming up. It's popping up now, right after decades of this. But what I find so interesting is that a lot of those growers are very keen on learning more, but they're also hesitant because they don't know who's going to buy it and who's going to pay for it.
Right.
And then how they're going to get it in market. And so it's almost like a delay. Whereas if we had that infrastructure in place, we could just get going. But we clearly don't. And so they're helping facilitate that. They're also, I don't know the exact term, maybe you know it, but I learned that a lot of our acres are not actually owned. They're leased out to growers, right?
Yep.
So I think there's
so we had that conversation with Driscoll's. We right before the lockdown, we were out in California meeting with the head of Driscoll's, who is a phenomenal guy, system thinker. He's from Denmark, and spent his entire career in produce. And when he first came into Driscoll's, he wanted to take the entire supply chain organic, and he said it was so incredibly hard. And he said it was so humbling, and it made them better farmers because, they realized that it wasn't just something you could snap and suddenly you're off. 25% of their supply chain is organic, which is pretty remarkable. And I think, for all of us who try to purchase organic berries, how expensive those little clamshells are, they clearly know that that's what the consumer wants. So they're working towards it. But yeah, I think there's so much opportunity in that conversion process. And, it's across all of these different crops. And it's also recognizing that, how our tax dollars are being put to use. It's not how we would allocate them. And, I think if we had the choice to say, tax dollars can keep supporting this and subsidizing this conventional chemical ag system, or your tax dollars can be used to support regenerative organic ag. If we were given that choice for our farmers and for our families, I think it's pretty clear what choice we would make as consumers. And the companies are getting there, and Driscoll's will tell you that part of their hurdle is the fact that they've got these absentee landlords. And so on average, I think it's around 40% of the land is tenant occupied, so it's rented. And that's part of the challenge in the conversion is if the farmer's just renting the land, there really isn't a long-term incentive to improve soil health unless you bring in the landowner. And so in the conversations we had with Driscoll's was, let's think about hosting an event for your landowners and talk about regenerative agriculture as a process that's adding value to the asset that they hold. And they don't even have to worry about it, but This is what we're going to do. So again, it gets back to the education piece of this, which, we're all responsible for. I think we're all doing our part. You do an amazing job with Quinn's and the side of the box and just these beautiful videos that you've put out. And that's on all of us, and having been part of the first chapter of this movement, we're now really into this next chapter of it. And it can't be on any one person or one organization or one thing. So it's really when you see that change, when you see people doing their thing and lending their voice to it, to me, it's so important to celebrate that. And, something I learned personally as I was growing into this work, and I see it professionally all the time, is when we build something like a beautiful building or, anything that's beautiful and, worthy of our attention, it has scaffolding around it. And we put scaffolding around it as we construct these beautiful things. Well, we as people aren't any different. And we need that supportive scaffolding around us as we are creating these bigger, better versions, of ourselves and our brands and these organizations. And we can't forget that to really be that to each other. And I think you and I that to me is just the magic of this space. And I think through all of the vulnerability and all of the humanity that we've seen in this last year, that's the invitation is really to come together and collaborate, to figure out how to be that supportive scaffolding to each other as we build this out, because it's an incredible opportunity and nobody can do it by themselves.
No, clearly. Definitely not. Thanks, Robyn. I want to be cognizant of time, so I'm gonna wrap up. I'm trying to think if I know that I didn't have questions for you, but I have so many questions.
Well, and I think, the other thing we've talked about, Christy, is doing this with your 3 kids in tow and my 4 kids in tow, and what that looks like and what it means. And I think that's something for another day. But I also think to be totally honest and transparent around that too is really important, because you do need really good friends as you move through this work. And, I think people see the highs and they don't realize that underneath there's just all kinds of messy, lows and potholes and all these things that you hit.
And so many potholes. Yeah.
Yeah. And
so
to
many,
really,
what ifs.
Right. And to really honor that part of the journey as well. I think for me, when things get really hard, painfully hard, I've learned just to sit with that and try to be open to whatever the lesson is. If it's on a personal level, it's on a professional level. What do you and really just to sit with it. And I do. I think I look back now on the really, really hard times, and I think they were some of my greatest lessons. And I think it's where some of my greatest strength was built. And so to see those as part of the work, you can't avoid it. It's just part of the work towards the next thing that's going to open for you.
Definitely. I mean, making you stronger. I think any failure that I've ever had as well. I mean, once you can see clear again, right? When you're still in the trenches, but your head's kind of peeking over the side. Once you can really see clear and realize like, wow, there were so many lessons there and I just need to adapt and apply and move forward. But you do become so much more resilient and stronger and take different approaches. And personally, I mean, I've grown so much in 10 years. I'm sure you've grown so much in the years that you've been doing this. It's kind of insane how who I was 10 years ago to who I am now. And I know that everyone can say that on some level as years go by, but yeah, there are a lot of potholes in
and leadership requires, I mean, it takes a lot, it requires a lot. The responsibility is a lot, and it's not for everyone. And that's okay too, but, for those that really have sort of embraced that part of the work, to find those people that are like the sun who continually, give you that warmth and that energy. They are your best people, and hold them close. And, whether you see them every day, whether you grow apart, like they just become part of who you are. It becomes part of your heart and part of the work. And, I think too, to hold those ones close is so important too.
Thanks for listening. Make sure to check out Robyn's TED Talk and her must-read book, The Unhealthy Truth.